Hi, Beth. Welcome. All right, I will share my screen.
And do we want to pop into the chat introductions, or should we just do introductions because there's just a few of us?
Yeah, I think we could do them out loud. I think that'd be fine.
Yeah.
All right, can y'all see that? Okay, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to those who are here in person with us. Welcome to those who will watch the video later. We are excited to be here with y'all at the WFAN conference to share this presentation, this learning that we're excited to share. I'll introduce myself. I'm Michelle Osborne. I work at RAFI-USA. That's the Rural Advancement Foundation International. We're a farm advocacy nonprofit based in North Carolina. And I'll pass it to Ewan.
Hi, everybody. As Michelle said, we're super excited to be here. So thanks for having us. My name is Ewan Corral, and I work at an organization called Dakota Rural Action. And that is on the Oceti-Sakowin land, the home of the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people. And I'm just excited to be talking about messaging and language use with y'all today. So thank you. And then we would invite others to do introductions as well. And so if you want to come, on camera, we also invite that. But we were saying, in the chat, you could have your name, pronouns, location, organization, and role. But if you just come off mute and, introduce yourself that way, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Jules Salinas, she, they pronouns. I am with WFAN. I'm the executive director of WFAN, and I am currently on Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute land. Usually I am on Sandia land and Isleta land, Pueblos, but I am up in what is now called Fort Collins, Colorado. So that's where I'm on that different land. And I am so excited because I love this workshop. I've seen it with WFAN before and participated in it, and I just think it's an amazing workshop. It really got into my head, and I think about it a lot. So I'm excited to see it again.
Thank you. And then maybe Arlene?
Sure. So my name is Arlene Hunter, she, her pronouns. I live in rural Eastern Ontario, so in that zone between Toronto and Ottawa in Canada. And I live on territories that are unceded Algonquin people. And I am a dairy farmer with my husband, and I'm also started hosting a podcast with Kate called Nerd Language. That's how I ended up attending the conference. It's through Kate and my new podcast.
Thank you. Arlene, maybe share, if you can, a link to your podcast in the chat. That might be nice. And how about Beth Nelson?
Hi, I'm Beth Nelson, and I am in St. Paul, Minnesota. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. This is originally Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota land. I'm with North Central Region SARE, and I'm the regional director for the Upper 12 Midwest states. SARE is a USDA grant program. And I'm really looking forward to this workshop. Like many others, we are struggling to be more diverse and more inclusive. It's not hard when you're a big bureaucratic organization, but we are listening.
Thanks, Beth, for joining us. Hello, Michelle. How about you? And that's
Hi.
Michelle Hughes. Hi.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Hi, I'm Michelle Hughes. I use she, her pronouns. I'm on Mohican land in Columbia County, New York, Germantown, also called Germantown. I work for Glenwood, which is in Putnam County on Muncie Lenape land. Yeah, sorry, what was the the last part of the question?
Just organization role.
My role there, I'm the
and
Associate Director of Regional Food Programs. So I work on a lot of food access and food and health related programming. Yeah, I think a lot about how we use language. I think it's really important. So I really appreciate you doing this today. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Lily.
Hi. I'm Lily. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is on Ocheti-Sakowin land, and I work with Dakota Rural Action, and I'm a community organizer here working on food systems. And I'm super excited for today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you. And is it Giselle?
Yeah, it's Giselle, but
Giselle. Thank you.
yeah, Giselle. And I use she, her pronouns. I'm here in Iowa City, which was originally, I believe, Sioux, Meskwaki. There were several tribes here. And then I work for Iowa Valley RC&D as the program director. So do various different projects around local food and have been thinking a lot about equity work and storytelling. And so I'm really excited for this workshop.
Thank you. Awesome. And then Laurel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Laurel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Boulder County in Colorado, originally Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute territory. And I work with an organization called Garden to Table. I'm our garden director. Good morning. Sorry, I missed some of the other introductions.
Well, thank you for joining us. We recognize it's early, so thank you. All right. I think, Michelle, you can take it away.
All right. Yeah, so just want to talk a little bit about what we'll be going over today. So we did some introductions. We'll go over just some of our workshop agreements, our session goals. We'll talk a little bit about definitions of some of the words that we'll be using. Give a background for, yeah, just kind of some important concepts around what we'll be talking about. Talk about why this presentation is needed and how it came about. We will play a rousing game of Name That Company, and then wrap up, do some takeaways and evaluations. So that's how we'll be spending the next hour or so together. So in terms of workshop agreements, we'll just move right over to them. We offer this training as an invitation. We are definitely learners. We've developed this workshop over the last maybe almost 2 years of working together on this. And yeah, we offer it as an invitation. We invite you to join us and be learners together on this. We come with humility and vulnerability, recognizing that this material can be difficult at times. And along with that, we invite you to wrestle with the material, to be willing to be uncomfortable as we discuss these topics together. We invite you to listen deeply and also practice Zoom etiquette. So Zoom etiquette can look like, muting yourself. It can look like if you're doing something distracting in the background, maybe you turn your video off for a little bit. So things like that, that I think we are all probably pretty well versed in at this point. we are creating a brave space for learning together. So, you know, we can't guarantee that it will be a safe space in terms of feeling comfortable, but it will be a brave space for us to really tackle these issues together. And then lastly, we want to practice calling out instead of, sorry, we want to practice calling in instead of calling out. And what that means is calling out can often have some shame associated with it, or you know, inducing guilt or things like that. We want to call in, we want to invite each other to really wrestle with these topics. So those are our workshop agreements. Does anyone have any questions or comments or things that need to be clarified about those?
And or anything that you think we've missed? And then if we could just get some kind of, if you want to use one of the emojis for like a thumbs up, or just, you know, wave, let us know that this works for you.
All right, looks like we've got some people who are agreeing to these agreements, so that's great. Wonderful. Well, I will pass it over to Ewan now to talk about our session goals.
Yeah, thank you. So also, I just want to preface this with this presentation is ever evolving. And when we first started discussing this, we imagined in person, and we've yet been able to give this presentation in person. So we shifted to this virtual format, and this conference format is yet again another shift for us. And so normally we would have been in contact, like we would have known who was going to take our course, we would have been in contact, there would have been some pre-reading material and just some ability for us to add a little bit more kind of river banking around what it is we're going to discuss. So we recognize that some of us are like jumping in pretty cold, it's early in the morning, and I just want to like throw that out there, that you know, this is an organic process to have a very guided dialogue. So in this session, we want to expose participants to stories of xenophobic messaging used by corporations and leaders from around the world. We will begin to explore the impact of xenophobic messaging. We present this session as an initial messaging, narrative, anti-racism discussion around language use, specific to farm, food, agricultural movements, and agricultural movements typically rural in nature. We developed this like peer-to-peer, so using popular education theories and models. So the peer-to-peer, whether you are a professional that like is working in food and ag systems, or you're a leader within your community, or you're a farmer, and you will have these kinds of common like conversations and dialogues within your community. If you're further along and have had more experience or training, we ask for you to think about like, how do you lead conversations back in your community? Like, how are you instigating, or how are you inspiring people to have hard conversations about race and equity within the food and ag system? How are you, looking at language? And then how do we as leaders and professionals in the food and ag community disrupt xenophobic language back in our communities? Like, that's the goal, right? We want to know, like, how do we work together to disrupt this language when we're seeing it? Okay, I think we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so we're gonna jump in here. And again, because we didn't know what to expect, normally when we do this workshop, we try to keep it to less than 18 people thereabouts. So, so that each facilitator can stay with a small group. With this size of group, and welcome, I see that we had one more person join us. If you want to just introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. But so we're going to just stay in a large group today and kind of popcorn and discuss some terms that we think are important to talking about messaging and using appropriate messaging within food and ag campaigns. So the first one we're going to start with is institutional racism. And at this time, and I know we're like jumping right in, but at this time, what I would do is I would invite folks to, if you're able, come off, you know, mute, and also join by video if possible. And we are just going to popcorn and think about, what does institutional racism mean? What does it mean for you? Maybe where have you seen it in play? We're looking for the definition, right? We want to develop some working definitions of these terms.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it just means that there are systems that are set up to explicitly not support me, people like me with brown skin.
Thank you, Michelle. Do others have thoughts?
I'm still waking up, to be perfectly honest, but
Yes.
I'm thinking about how important it is to differentiate from individual racism. So I liked Michelle's words better than what I can come up with here, but I'm just thinking what might be some ways of saying not individual, not what occurs between two people, but what occurs within the scaffolding or structures in our lives that institutions are responsible for, or something like that.
Absolutely.
I might also add that while some systems are set up to explicitly be racist, that sometimes it's not explicit, or I mean, not the word inadvertent, but it's not intentional, but the way that they've been set up is in a way that has ended up being exclusionary. Because of
Yes.
the people who created the systems were not thinking of it in a way that was inclusive of all people.
Correct.
Yeah.
Like early on, there was a kind of like setting up a system so it was protecting of one individual or one types of individuals.
Sure, yeah, or with an amount of ignorance of the barriers and the experiences of other people, so that those other perspectives weren't even taken into account because of who started it in the beginning.
I think to build off what Arlene said, one thing that's really stuck in my head right now is this mess with the USDA and the pig food loans, and then this case against them for discriminating against white farmers by not offering white farmers reparations for people they already discriminated against. And that there's any thought that that would be a thing, that you would think that, I would have hoped that people would just be appalled that it happened in the first place and be doing whatever they could to improve the situation. And I don't think that filing a countersuit for racism against white people really counts as helping.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, I would say like just to build off of things that I've heard people say is like that it's like designed that way. It's like a system that was designed to privilege white people. And so like policies and cultural norms and behaviors and everything are designed to like make it comfortable and easy and benefit people that look like me.
Yes. So I'm going to give a textbook definition of institutional racism occurs within institutions and systems of power. This refers to the unfair policies and discriminatory practices of particular institutions, schools, workplaces, etc., that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institutions. The next phrase that we will attempt to define together is white fragility. And again, I just invite folks as they feel inspired to come off mute and give some thoughts on that.
I'll give an example from the great state of Iowa. The last legislative session, they tried to ban the teaching of the 1619 podcast. And there's a lot of discussion just about like, if you're talking about institutional racism or racist history, then it's like un-American and also sort of like attacking the idea of being white, that there's something wrong with it. And that's a great example of white fragility that I know. I'm laughing because it's uncomfortable, not because it's funny.
Oh, I 100% understand that. Thank you for that. That is an example, in my opinion, of white fragility at an institutional level, right? Like it's such a high level. I think sometimes when people talk about white fragility, it becomes more like person to person. And people have personal experiences with it. Do others have thoughts about white fragility?
I feel like on a person-to-person level, it feels a lot like when, living in rural Iowa, you'll hear people say, well, why do we need Black History Month? Because there isn't White History Month, and I didn't own slaves. I'm like, well, you're not fixing anything either, though, and you're not doing better. You're just not as actively being horrible. It's not really the same thing.
I remember when I was a kid, I would ask my parents, like, why is there Mother's Day and Father's Day, but there's no Kids Day? And they looked at me and they said, because every day is Kids Day. And I kind of feel like the same thing. I was like, why is there Black History Month and Native American History Month now? And it's like, because every month is White History Month. So it just seems like that's become normative, right? Is that the white experience is normative. And so when that is challenged, it feels like, I forget who said the quote, but basically when people who are used to being in power are, asked to have equity, that feels like oppression to them. And so that's how I see white fragility, is that this defensiveness and false feeling of oppression for equity.
I also feel like when white people are confronted with race and racism, it can make them feel like they're losing their own identity. And I think like the problem with like creating race in the beginning was that it was intentionally set up to erase all of our cultures, including white cultures, because like there are so many like, white, like black and white, there are these like social constructs that we made up, but there's no real cultural basis there. Like, I mean, there is a black culture that I feel like has developed, but yeah, it's like people are Irish and Scandinavian. There are all of these, there are all of these like cultural identities that get erased, and I feel like when people sorry, I was just muted. But anyway, I think it can just be like jarring for people who are like being confronted with these things for the first time.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Sorry about that technical difficulty. If folks aren't speaking, just remember to mute yourself. I think because of the different platforms, there will be a lot of feedback. So thank you. So again, in terms of a textbook definition for white fragility, we have white fragility is discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequity and injustice. And then we have a quote from Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, the book. In a nutshell, it is the defensive reactions so many white people have when crucial worldviews, positions, or advantages are questioned or challenged. For a lot of white people, just suggesting that being white has meaning will trigger a deep defensive response. And that defensiveness serves to maintain both our comfort and our positions in a racially inequitable society from which we benefit. So the next word might be a little bit trickier. It's xenophobia. And I think sometimes people, while it's super concise, because it's one of the phobias, people have a hard time like wrestling with it a little bit. So I'm curious, like, how do you think xenophobia like plays out in your life, or how do you see it kind of out in the world, or if you have some kind of definition for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think of xenophobia just as like fear of the other in a way. And I think of a conversation I had with a neighbor when I was living in Des Moines, and he felt that he worked in construction and just thought that, people from other countries were stealing his job, which of course there's like a sense of entitlement there that it's yours, but also just like this fear that like people are crossing borders coming into our country. There's this like big, like something's going to be taken from me, and they are other people who are not from here, who don't belong here, and like the subtext is like don't deserve to be here.
That's very articulate. Thank you.
I finally started drinking coffee, so thank you for bearing with me before that.
How about anybody else? Maybe somebody who hasn't shared yet about xenophobia. Well, as I said, it's pretty straightforward, and it's the dislike of or prejudice against people from other countries, right? So it's very like locale based. And I think that's what makes it potentially a little unique. And then the last thing that we just wanted to ensure we have some, similarities and ideas around is dog whistle. So I'm curious if folks want to share potentially an example of a dog whistle. Sometimes that's an easy way, like a good entry point into this discussion, because this is probably the least definitive in our definitions today.
I just heard someone on the radio use this, the radio news, about the elections that just happened. There was one in, I think it was, forget if it was New Jersey or Massachusetts, in the governor's race. The Republican candidate was saying that, he wanted to ban critical race theory teaching in schools. And they were saying that that was like a dog whistle to, I guess, people who might hold certain racist views. Sort of like a call to like action without like having to explicitly say things that would be like very unacceptable, but it's just sort of like a sort of coded way of saying something to certain people. Without raising too many other flags.
Yeah, no, you have really done a good job of that, Michelle. Thank you. Anybody else maybe can think of dog whistles that they have heard over time?
I think this, I don't know if you can see my hand. I think it's this or this, depending on that became a quick dog whistle for a certain group of people, as Michelle pointed out. It's a coded call to action, that hand signal that they try. It's a white supremacy hand signal, and they try to say, oh, I'm just saying okay, or I'm just saying like, oh, it's just a game to put the finger in, like caught you or whatever. And it's like, no, that's not going to fly anymore. We know what it means. So yeah.
Yes.
I think of President Trump and how many phrases and symbols and tweets he used, and that I can't even think of a specific one right now is maybe kind of telling, right? Because the whole idea is to call up the white supremacy, but be able to create plausible deniability for oneself that he's not being racist. Of course, we all know he was also often very overtly racist, but so many dog whistles in that presidency.
Yes, absolutely. So for the sake of time, I'm gonna just read through a few. So dog whistles use language which appears normal to the majority, but which continues specific things to intended audiences. They are generally used to convey messages on issues likely to provoke controversy without attracting negative attention. One example may be use of the phrases family values to signal to Christians that a candidate would support policies promoting Christian values without alienating non-Christian supporters. Use of a dog whistle is by its nature hard to prove and usually denied. Some argue that the concept is too vague and prone to false accusations. So in our, and these are also very limited versions of dog whistles, but for example, when we are talking about food and ag policy, when people refer to foreign, like a foreign corporation or foreign ownership, they're usually referring to a Latin, Asian, or Arab environment or corporation institution. But then we use the word ally to mean like white nations, or they are identified by name, right? So just the context in which we will use certain words to convey something. So I think we're good on these definitions. I would just pause for a minute to make sure that there wasn't anything else that anybody wanted to bring forward, or if anybody had any questions. Okay. Hearing none, I think we can move on. So, these are just some more, I think a lot of you will have seen this, but, we just think it's important to kind of make sure that we're all operating from the same foundation. So quality versus equity. And then with this, when we think of like the illustrations of things like internalized racism, interpersonal racism, and structural racism, right? So we think about like how all of these things will impact equity, and how we know that like equality isn't enough to bring forward an equitable space. Okay, next slide. And this is where we'll go over a little bit about the background and kind of just lay of the land and some assumptions. And I think Michelle.
Yeah, so probably y'all have seen this image or something like it previously, but this really shows the corporate consolidation of our food system, the ways that just a few giant corporations really run so much of our food system. And so we have a few kind of assumptions that we're going into the rest of this presentation with. And so the first one that's big is that the world that we live in is dominated by capitalism and corporate consolidation. And obviously we're going to be particularly talking about the ag sector. Markets are not open and competitive. And this environment really invites the type of language that we're going to be diving into today. There are consolidated global markets and a lack of corporate accountability. White supremacy is at the root of these capitalistic structures. And the goal that is not currently reached, but I think what Ewan and I and our organizations, and hopefully y'all as well, the goal that we see is that our agricultural system would be community-led, community-supported, and community-used, so that it would not be dominated by these corporate interests. And the last assumption that we'll get into more is that whiteness really has claimed our rural areas. And so these rural spaces, and particularly ag spaces, aren't really seen as welcoming spaces for people of diverse racial or ethnic backgrounds. And so I'll pass it back to Ewan to lead us into this conversation further.
So why is this conversation important? As we said early on, it is part of a larger equity conversation. And we started thinking about this to bring this forward as an opportunity to audit and assess our own campaigns and our messaging and how we develop narrative and the language and tools we use to develop narrative. We want a way for us to be part of a solutions-based thinking and participate in dismantling racism, because we think language use is a very important part of that, especially when we're talking about rural food and ag campaigns in spaces where there is, real and perceived dominance by white individuals. And then we think that awareness leads to transformation. In particular, we started talking about this back in 2018, 2019. There were groups of us who belonged to different coalitions and networks collaborative spaces, and they were policy, advocacy, and organizing spaces. And we were seeing this language be used and like play out in real time. And it was particularly disconcerting in policy spaces where, you know, we would discuss sustainable ag policy, and we would talk about needing to eliminate language around that it's like foreign corporations that are like ruining or not helpful to local and regional food systems. And then we would get pushback and people would say like, well, it's not all foreign corporations, and that we didn't want to push our congressional leaders to just call it corporate consolidation instead of foreign consolidation of the US food and ag markets. And people would say, well, some foreigners are our allies. And then they would refer to white-led nations like Canada or Western European countries, right? And so in those moments, it became very apparent to some of us that that in and of itself is xenophobic, and it is a form of racism, and it's being perpetuated in our own important organizing spaces. And so we just want to set this stage and hope that people start to reevaluate language that they see in grant proposals, in RFPs for grants, in when you develop a campaign for a certain type of agriculture, even the concept around, like local foods, things around like eminent domain. And, we even have looked at like the country of origination labeling. Cool. So there's a lot of places where we use problematic language. And I think sometimes we think of it as protectionism. And so this is why we think this conversation is important. All right.
So I wanted to just read an excerpt from this book that I was reading while we were developing this material. So this is from a book of essays called Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. And the author writes, "Language is power. When you turn torture into enhanced interrogation or murdered children into collateral damage, you break the power of language to convey meaning, to make us see, feel, care. You can use the power of words to bury meaning or to excavate it. If you lack words for a phenomenon, an emotion, a situation, you can't talk about it, which means you can't come together to address it, let alone change it. Vernacular phrases like catch-22, cyberbullying, the 99% and the 1% have helped us to describe, but also reshape our world." So that's really what we want to talk about today is, in our agricultural sector, in the ag world, how do we break language? And what are some meanings that need to be excavated? As Ewan mentioned, we are part of a lot of, both of our organizations are part of some national coalitions, and we were just really noticing some of the language that's often used and felt like pretty concerned about it, felt like it was problematic and just concerning in terms of the ways that we want to show up as organizations, as coalitions, the policies that we're advocating for, et cetera. And so that was really the inspiration for this workshop. And so what we're going to do next is really explore the values that we often put on different companies, and we're going to do that through a rousing game of Name That Company. So this is my favorite part of this presentation. It's very cheesy and fun, but basically what's going to happen is I'm I'm going to read through descriptions of companies. And at the end of the description, I will say, name that company. And at that point, you can take yourself off mute. You can put your answer in the chat, but you can, if you know the company that we're referring to, then you can name it. So please hold your answers until the end of the slide when I say name that company. And we'll talk a little bit about why we're highlighting some of these different companies as we go through. So before we start, are there any questions? Okay. So our first company, question 1 of name that company. This company was founded in Virginia. This company acquired 40 companies between 1981 and 2008. They were fined $12.6 million by the EPA in 1997 for 6,900 violations of the Clean Water Act. Its processing plant in Tar Heel, North Carolina was the site of an almost 15-year dispute between the company and the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, which had tried since 1994 to organize the plant's roughly 5,000 hourly workers. It's the largest pork producer in the world, and it was acquired by WH Group, a Chinese holding company, in 2013. Can anyone name that company?
You can come off mute or put it, oh, I see something in the chat. Smithfield.
I saw a guess for Smithfield, and that
Hormel.
is,
Oh,
yeah, that's Smithfield is the company that we were looking for. I find their tagline to be laughable, good food responsibly. But so what's the point? Why are we bringing up Smithfield in this example? So if we go back to the descriptors, you know, a lot of times in our work, we have seen Smithfield referred to as, oh, well, you know, they are a Chinese company now, so therefore, you know, we don't support them. They don't care about, you know, the U.S., whatever. They don't. I would argue that Smithfield was unethical for a long time, regardless of who owned the company, right? So you can see the ways that they have had environmental issues, the ways that they have treated their workers poorly, etc. And so any sort of value judgment we would place on them based on where they are held seems a little short-sighted, given the ways that they have yeah, been unethical in many ways from the beginning. So that's why we wanted to bring up Smithfield. Would you add anything, Ewan, to this?
No, I think you covered it. I think that the basis is in this example, and you know, lots of examples, that the founding of an institution is and you know, can be American, but then over time, because of the way, you know, food and agriculture is corporatized and even still like traded on the US stock market, but you know, has a majority holdership by a Chinese holding company, means that people can now pass this off, like all of the destruction that Smithfield has caused, as being caused by, quote, Chinese people or Chinese institutions, when that is a fallacy. And so that, I think, is the, you know, major point of this example.
Okay, question 2 of name that company. So this company was bought by Dow Chemical Company in 2001. They were responsible for the Hawks Tunnel disaster. This happened in West Virginia from 1927 to 1932. What happened was during the construction of this tunnel, workers found silica and they were asked to mine it for use in electroprocessing steel. The workers were not given masks or breathing equipment to use while mining, and due to silica dust exposure, many workers developed silicosis, a debilitating lung disease. According to a marker on the site, there were 109 admitted deaths. They were also responsible for the 1984 Bhopal disaster, which caused 16,000 deaths because of a gas release. India tried to extradite the CEO of this company from the US to India to face charges, but the US would not allow it. Ultimately, they paid $500 per family in damages. Residents of Bhopal still cannot drink the water, and the plant site still has not been cleaned up. Can anyone name this company? You can put it in the chat or say it out loud. I see a couple guesses for Union Carbide, and that's correct. That's the company that we were looking for. And so why are we offering this example? This is an example of a US-based company that is acting badly, unethically, however we might want to say it, in a different country, right? So, you know, just to say that just because a company is a US company does not absolve it of any sort of responsibility. A US-based company can behave unethically all over the world, and they do. And this is just one example of that. And in this case, in Union Carbide, they were, you know, not protecting workers and communities in the US, and then were able to do that in other countries as well. And you can see the way that the US government colluded with that company, with Union Carbide, to, you know, not allow the CEO to be extradited and face charges over there. So that's just another example of corporate power showing up. So the third question in Name That Company, I'm sorry, in Name That Company. So this company is the world's largest food and beverage company. They have over 200 brands, including Nesquik, San Pellegrino, and DiGiorno. They were the subject of a boycott in the late 1970s and early 80s because of their aggressive marketing of breast milk substitutes, particularly in developing countries. They are based in Switzerland. Can anyone name that company? I see a few guesses for Nestle, and that is correct. That's the company we were looking for. So why do we bring up this example? As Ewan mentioned, a lot of times when we hear people talking about, quote, foreign companies, they are referring to companies with a brown population, basically. And so here is a company, a foreign company, a non-US company, based in Switzerland, that is doing bad around the world. You know, a lot of times when European or Canadian countries are referred to, in the spaces that we've seen at least, they are not mentioned with kind of the disdain that we see companies based in other countries receive. And so we just want to kind of highlight that European companies, excuse me, can be poor actors as well. So that's why we wanted to bring up this Nestle example. And so we have one last company in Name That Company. So question 4, last one, of Name That Company. So this company, in 1902, an antitrust suit was brought against them for conspiring to control the meatpacking industry. Their meatpacking plants in Chicago were the inspiration for Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. They were founded in 1855 in Massachusetts as Swift and Company. Brands include Peter Pan peanut butter and Butterball turkeys. They were bought in 2007 by a Brazilian company. Can anyone name that company? Oh man, this one is trickier. I see a guess for Unilever. It's not Unilever. All right, I will reveal the answer. It's JBS. JBS. So in this example, it's another example of a company that was originally US based and was doing unethical, exploitative things for, in this case, more than a century before it was ever bought out by a Brazilian company. And so again, a lot of people refer to JBS as this is a foreign corporation, quote unquote, when in fact it was quite homegrown. And so we just want to kind of upend these narratives that are often told around these companies, and really just think about you know, the ways that companies can allow people to believe that they are more wholesome or smaller than they actually are. You know, we mentioned the brands, for example, that JBS has, right, with Peter Pan peanut butter or Butterball turkeys, and you might think, oh, that's just, you know, that's just one little company, Peter Pan, when in fact it is owned by a large conglomeration. And so to kind of sum up this name that company game, we really want to focus on what are the common characteristics of a multinational corporation that allow them to exploit people, to mess up our communities, to consolidate our food and ag system. What is it about how capitalism and multinational corporations operate that, you know, what is it that we oppose, right? So it's not where a company is based that is so troublesome, but rather the consolidation, the lack of accountability, the unchecked power that corporations have that really are problematic. And so when we are developing our campaigns, or, you know, if you're leading a corporate campaign or something like that, really focusing on those issues will make your campaign stronger rather than focusing on where a corporation is based. So I'm going to pass it to Ewan to just dive in a little bit more to that.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for that name, that company. It's one of our favorites. So I just shared in both the chats a link to a news article, and this article is a little bit dated, but it is something that we would have shared like prior to our session with a couple other articles. And just as a note, in our session, we placed a PDF in the information for our session, which includes all of our slides. And then at the end of that, it includes 3 links to 3 articles that we think are kind of useful when thinking about this, you know, this opportunity to re-examine language, especially as it relates to food and agriculture. And so some of the takeaways from Name That Company are, you know, a continued pushing forward the narrative that these now multinational corporations are still rooted in rural America. So for the examples of corporations that were founded in rural America for the most part, and then now are multinational corporations, there are there are pieces of the narrative, like when it's appropriate, the current like leaders and CEOs within those corporations lean into the fact that they are American, founded and still like are so very American. But then when they come under scrutiny, or if there is like a debate about them kind of through the media, or even within policy spaces, they will be referred to as kind of these foreign operators and these foreign operations. And we think that that is inherently problematic, right? Because what we should be doing is we should be pulling out and attacking the core reasons that these large, monolith corporations are not good for food and ag systems. When we have this space, it creates for othering and a confusion of values for community members when we're talking about food and ag institutions. So we have, the false narrative that publicly traded corporations have a country of origin, right? The sense that if a corporation is homegrown, then they care about their country's citizens. And also, we think it's important to understand that our economies are built on multinational structures. And so, we should be trying to fix the corporations or eliminate how the corporations play in our food and ag system, and not attempting to other them or make it about like where organization's founded from, or that it operates from a foreign country. So then if we go to, and I guess I will stop and this is a good part to see if folks have questions about name that company, the attributes that we talked about, the different corporations. If there's anything that people feel inspired to share that they also feel about this, or if there are questions that we could examine for a minute. Okay. I'm trying to track the chat as well. And I know there's some other questions that once we wrap up, I think we can get to as well. Okay. So then if we look at like tools for examining language, I mean, a lot of this is, are we stopping to be more thoughtful when we're looking at different bodies of language and writing? And whether it's in the media or, like I said earlier, campaigns that we're developing ourselves. So identifying the dog whistles, examples of xenophobic or racially charged language or phrases. Why are they using those phrases? What do those phrases mean to them? What are they going to mean to readers? What does it mean to us as the individual reading at that moment? What is the point in having those phrases or using that terminology? Why is it problematic? And what should the focus be? Like, what should we be focusing on? These are some things that, as we examine our own campaigns and within our own institutions, we find examples of this. At Dakota Rural Action, we have a farm beginnings training, and we've had it now for 12 years. And very early on, we used extremely problematic, very Uncle Sam, like, we want you, do you own land? Do you want to do sustainable agricultural, production? And it was like, you know, when I go back and I look at some of the stuff that was created within my own institution, you know, not a decade ago or just a decade ago, it is the type of language that is kind of status quo, because we aren't stopping to be thoughtful about it, especially from predominantly rural, white-led institutions that work in agriculture. And so you can find examples of this, you know, I would imagine, in lots of places. And so it's just important for us to start questioning, like, why do we use certain language, and what language can we use instead that is more inviting, and helps us to even, like, you know, diversify and make food and agricultural systems more equitable. If, you know, some of the things that I will just kind of lay out about the article that I shared, knowing that it's a little bit dated. This was about the Smithfield plant here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And so much of that article is othering and race baiting. And it was very early on in the pandemic, and we had our governor in line with federal officials, Alex Azar, who, you know, was at the time in the Trump administration, and they were saying that in South Dakota, the reason why the pandemic was spreading in this meat packing plant wasn't because of their working conditions, but because of the way they lived. And they didn't live, you know, normal American lives. And there was so much about also how we had to protect Smithfield and groups like Smithfield, because they were protecting our food supply in this critical moment. And Smithfield was going to get, you know, and did get a huge amount of federal, you know, funds to a multinational corporation, but the immigrant workers could not receive any federal assistance when they had to close down. And they weren't going to receive any of the payments that U.S. citizens were receiving. And so it's this way in which our government was even helping to support multinational institutions over humans. And the way that the shift in the language changes around one institution, depending on, like, what someone wants from, you know, in this case, the government. And so we think it's super important to look at all the ways in which we want to demonize people from other places. And this article is a very good example of that. And so I think I will stop there unless people have questions about tools for examining language and or that article. Because I know folks have not probably had a chance to read it. Some, maybe you're perusing it. Anything further that you would add, Michelle, there? And like I said, if people have questions.
Yeah, I'll just add, we really, although this article is dated, we think it's a great example of ways that dog whistles and xenophobic messaging was used by both Smithfield and the federal government to you know, minimize the experiences of people of color, of immigrant workers in our food and ag industry. And yeah, it's very troubling. And so I think just being able to recognize the way that this is happening and then advocate for policies, et cetera, that break down those types of messaging, I think is really important. Yeah, well, we can go on to the next slide. So kind of wrapping up what we're wanting to get across is really that leaning on this type of xenophobic messaging, the xenophobic language, takes away from the opportunity to organize directly around the issues at hand, right? It also weakens your campaign and shrinks the groups and communities that you can work with. The argument against the corporatization and consolidation of power, goods, and resources holds true without resorting to xenophobic or racial slurs, right? I think the real issue that we want to point to is lack of corporate accountability, the oversized power that corporations have in our society. We want to point to that rather than any sort of messaging around where a company is owned or based or anything like that. And I think that, you know, this is also, it kind of bleeds over into other areas, right? In terms of when we start thinking about what, you know, we use some language around independent family farmer or local control or country of origin labeling even, and just thinking about really wanting to examine our language more fully and make sure that we're being precise, that we're getting the message across that we really want to get across when we use this language. And so we'll move on to the next slide. I'll pass it to Ewan.
Yeah, so we recognize that this is an interesting format to give this information. And also, there hasn't been any time for like small group or for reflection. And so we are curious if folks are inspired to talk about anything that has come up for you or anything that you would like to bring forward for the rest of the group. Is there something that you might do differently? Like, are you, prepared to be that vulnerable and say like, oh, there's this thing. Potentially, maybe you have thought about dog whistles a little bit differently. And we recognize that this is a lot, knowing that you haven't been able to evaluate an article or a piece of writing and one that we would have like taken apart in a different way. So I'll just stop to see if people have any initial reflections or take.
Hey, I was just going to say that I, am interested in knowing how you go about, we've talked about how we come from places of our own bias. And so how do we get help to see whether we have xenophobic language or, not inviting language in the materials we use? Should it be the people we are trying to work with, the community? I know a lot of organizations are hiring outside experts to come in, and we're not really sure about that approach, but have other organizations used that? Or I saw Ewan was nodding her head. Yes, bring the communities you're trying to serve. So.
Yeah, I would say, so it is interesting because Beth, I recognize you work for an arm of the USDA essentially, right? And so I would say that in that environment, like for those of us who work in institutions where we have a population we serve, right? And those models are interesting in and of themselves, but yes. So I come from a place where we do grassroots organizing and we're members based and our organ. And so like our members are helping us to develop that language, right? And so, but in institutions, both government and NGO, where you have a population that you serve, so maybe you don't have the voice from within the institution, there has to be a process by which you develop like language and understanding of the program, campaign, whatever it is, with those that are impacted, right? And because it's the only way that we develop the language that's culturally appropriate, that is also like inspiring to get across whatever goal it is that we want. So yes, I would say that. And I would also say that, and as a lot of us know, the like racial, like the DEI and like racial equity work and the folks coming into historically white-led institutions, which would include the government institutions and lots of food and agricultural nonprofits, are hiring outside people to come in and look at both like dismantling white supremacy and white fragility within the systems, like within the accountability systems, like what does it mean to be professional in an institution, like all of these kinds of things. And then also this more untangible things, like not the policy and procedures and you know, not how you set up hiring and these kinds of things, but also like how do you create workplace culture? And so, and now lots of us are like coming back into workplace and like how with this new mindset about understanding the racial inequities that have been in place in so many of our institutions for so long, we like all of those cultures should be re-examined. So people doing like the DEI assessments or the racial equity assessments within their institutions or departments by outside people who are not invested in those results, like in that commentary and that analysis, I think is important. Like, I think, you know, I know a lot of those people are inundated right now and you can't even get FaceTime with them, but like having people help you reevaluate your languages, your policies, like how you write descriptions, I think is very helpful. And especially if they are professionals in the DEI realm.
Thanks.
I'd like to share a little, Lynn Dykstra here, of where I got it wrong. This is about 15 years ago, and my daughter was in high school and learning about privilege. And in my fragile way of looking at the world, privilege meant something. That's what the word meant. And she was learning from a historical perspective, and I kept arguing about the word. That's not what the word means. That's not what the word means. And all of a sudden there was this epiphany that I needed to step back and see what was being presented and not take ownership that only I could define what a word meant. And very humbling, very, very humbling. And I'm still struggling with how adamant I was that that's the wrong word. We shouldn't use that word for describing this issue, and how wrong I was. And I see that now as we go through what does Black Lives Matter mean? And that we're arguing about the words instead of stepping back and seeing what the huge problem is that our society is facing, and let people use the words that make sense to them in describing something. And this is very difficult, but you grow through this by realizing that, you know, I don't get to define everything anymore. That's just not the way it should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. That was really powerful share. I really appreciate that. Also, just here in the chat, because I know that maybe we're not, like, depending on what platform you're on, you might not see out the chat. There is Laurel Smith, you know, brings up a good point that anytime we or others drop the phrase foreign corporations, we're missing an opportunity to focus on the behavior that we're actually trying to scrutinize, corporate consolidation. And that's like such a lead takeaway. And I know there's moments when you're creating these types of presentations when you're like, well, the solution's really simple. Like we shouldn't say this and we shouldn't say that, and we can replace these words. And yes, but in order to get to that very simple solution, people have to stop and think about the words. And I think that's the important part, that all of us, as we go back into our respective fields and our places, and even if we are farmers or ranchers or food producers or growers in our community, it tends to mean that you're a leader within your community because you are growing food and sustenance. And in that moment, we have an opportunity to help change language so that it is more inviting to anybody who might be coming through our communities, especially rural communities. Anything else before we wrap up? The one other thing that I would say is in that PDF of our slides, we shared the Smithfield example article because we think it's just pretty spot on of all the stuff. And then we shared a ProPublica article that is quite fascinating because it details so much about like American, American corporatization contribution to like making our food systems unsafe. And so we thought that was super eye-opening. And then there is one that's a very recent piece. It's a small kind of opinion piece, and it's from a historically white-led rural, Midwest farm and branch group. And I would say that typically they haven't always used this very like neutral language. And so it's a very good example of an organization moving towards and using language that is not othering, and it doesn't rely on xenophobic tendencies or language.
So this is a really big conversation, and I appreciate that people are talking about having an extra meetup, and I hope that comes to be, because I think it's a very important conversation. And I will say that I don't know if I've shared this with the two of you before, but after seeing this presentation the first time, I started being much more aware of where xenophobic language is being used, and even the use of farm workers or ag workers as compared to calling our land stewards or farmers, right? Because that othering language, when you hear farm worker, the person that comes to mind is not a white man, right? And if you use farmer, oftentimes the image that comes to mind is, old MacDonald, right? And so how do we shift that language without losing track of the fact that what we historically called farm workers or land stewards have been so excluded from policy conversations, from talking about everything, and being at the table to really be able to have some agency over their own lives and their communities' lives. And so I think this is a conversation that is bigger because most of the policy is written towards farmers, and by farmers, it's coded dog whistle language for landowners, or sometimes tenants, but usually landowners, right? And so, again, this is a much bigger conversation, but that conversation rose in me after watching this presentation the first time. So I have to thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Jules. I know that we're running out of time. I did want to ask you, I don't know logistically how to do a meetup on Hoova. Is that something you can shed some light on?
Yeah, I believe it can be created in the homepage. So anybody can create a meetup. So yeah, anybody can create a meetup. So we should be able to do that. Yep, there you go. Wally, appreciate that.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. Well, and thank you guys. And of course, there's many, you know, our contact information is on the PDF that we shared, and then we can meet up through this Hoova thing. And Wally, thank you so much for your interaction, and I will reach out directly. And I think that's it for us. I think we're at time.
Great. Thank you
Thank y'all.
both. Appreciate you.
Bye.
All right. Thank you, everybody.